Famine in Gaza due to Israel's deliberate starvation policy. More than 500,000 people in immediate danger. Yet Israel intensifies its war, backed by the US and Western allies. How can an engineered famine be allowed to happen in the 21st century? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. A moral indictment and a failure of humanity itself. The words of UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres after famine was officially declared in Gaza City. The IPC, a UN-backed panel that assesses food security, says 250,000 Palestinians are in immediate danger and even more at risk within the coming weeks. Yet thousands of tons of food lie just hundreds of meters away from Gaza, barred from entering by Israeli troops. The engineered starvation of Palestinians is unfolding in full view of the world in the age of the internet. Far from being shamed, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu plans to widen the war, armed and backed by the US and European and Western allies. How can Israel's policy of deliberate starvation be stopped? What's the reality of life for people in Gaza? And how will future generations judge today's world, one that allowed the famine in Gaza to happen? We'll speak to our guests shortly, but first, this report from Victoria Gatenby.
12-year-old Huda is wasting away before her mother's eyes. What aid agencies warned for months has now become a reality. Famine is spreading across Gaza, a crisis they say is entirely man-made and entirely preventable.
My daughter has been suffering from acute malnutrition since March, when Israel closed Gaza's borders. She spent 3 months in hospitals, but her condition did not improve. She used to weigh 35 kilos, but now she's down to 20.
A United Nations-backed report by the IPC, which tracks food insecurity, confirms more than 500,000 Palestinians are facing starvation, destitution and death. That's a quarter of Gaza's population. More than 280 Palestinians have already died of hunger, including 5-month-old Zainab. Doctors say she was born healthy but died of acute malnutrition. She needed a special infant formula that could not be found in Gaza, blocked at the border by Israel.
It is a famine in 2025, a 21st century famine, watched over by drones and the most advanced military technology in history. It is a famine openly promoted by some Israeli leaders as a weapon of war.
Israel's foreign ministry has denied there's a famine in Gaza, accusing the IPC of lying without substantiating the allegations. Since May, an organisation backed by the US and Israel has handled humanitarian aid deliveries, operating a now notorious system. Every day, thousands line up, desperate for food. The UN has described these distribution sites as death traps. Israeli forces and American security contractors have killed more than 2,000 people at or near them. The few aid trucks allowed in are crowded as soon as they arrive, scenes of chaos triggered by desperation. This famine also has legal consequences. Last year, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for the Israeli Prime Minister on charges of war crimes, including using starvation as a method of warfare. With the UN officially declaring famine, the legal implications could be broader.
There are governments that are supporting Israel, that are encouraging Israel. And when we see these acts, which they cannot claim to be indifferent to or to ignore that they're taking place, they have to face the fact that they too may be held responsible as accomplices before an international court or tribunal.
Aid agencies say this is a famine unfolding within a few hundred meters of food that Israel is systematically blocking at Gaza's borders. They warn that without a ceasefire and unrestricted humanitarian access, preventable deaths will soar. Victoria Gatenby, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. From Deir al-Balah in central Gaza, we're joined by Dr. Tarek Loubani, an emergency physician and medical doctor at the Glia project, which helps to develop healthcare systems in low-resource communities. Tess Ingram, a spokesperson for the UN children's agency UNICEF, is also in Gaza. She's in Al-Mosawi in the south. And in Eugene, Oregon, is Michael Fakhri, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food and a professor at the Oregon University School of Law. Warm welcome to you all. Dr. Tarek, if we can start with you, can you tell us something of the symptoms of starvation among patients that you and your colleagues are seeing and treating right now, the number of them, and how your colleagues are dealing with all of this as you yourselves are going without food?
The first thing to say is that we rarely see patients just because of starvation. Of course, that does happen, but primarily we're seeing patients because they've been shot or bombed by the Israelis. Either there have been two major kinds of massacres, tent massacres, in which patients are killed in their tents or wounded in their tents, and aid massacres. So sometimes we see patients who are clearly facing starvation, who are dying of hunger, where we can clearly count out, like you saw in the photos of those affected patients, we can see all of their bones, all of their ribs. There's no more muscle left or hardly any muscle left in people who are trying to go to aid sites or who are being bombed at home. We know that their outcomes are very poor. We know that they do very badly. They don't have what they need to heal, and they are usually on the brink of death when they are then shot or bombed. It's an absolutely terrible situation. As for the second point, you had mentioned about our colleagues, we are all starving as well. Today, I had one meal. I consider myself very lucky. It felt great because there's some product coming in, so I was able to have a little bit of cheese, which was cut off for literally months. And also, we've been able to finally eat meat after almost 3 or 4 months of not having any of that available. My colleagues are all losing weight. All of them are starving, and everybody here is affected, 100% of people in Gaza.
Tess, what have you been seeing at nutrition points this week? Tell us about the cases of severe malnutrition that UNICEF is witnessing there on the ground.
I went to 3 UNICEF-supported nutrition points in just the last couple of days, and I was shocked by what I saw there. It's the most severe cases of malnutrition I've seen in large numbers of children at these sites. The first place I went to, there were parents clamoring at the door, banging to come inside to get what little they could for their children. And then once inside, it really was, like Tarek is explaining, exhausted staff who themselves are hungry, overwhelmed with these desperate parents just trying to do everything they can to meet the massive needs. The first mother I spoke to herself was malnourished, and she has 2 children, a 2-year-old and a 1-year-old, both with severe acute malnutrition. Mohammed, who is 2, his hair has fallen out, and Noor, who's 14 months. She was born a healthy baby at 4 kilograms, and now more than a year later, she is just 5 kilograms. She should be almost double that by this point. And their mother, Anish, was crying, saying that she's worried that she's going to lose Noor and that there is nothing that she can do about it. It was a similar story from the second mother I met. We were talking for a while before she revealed to me that she's 7 months pregnant, and I hadn't even noticed her stomach because she is so malnourished. Her doctor has told her that she needs to be on bed rest for the remainder of her pregnancy, but she grabbed my hand and crying, she said, I can't go on bed rest because my little boy, his name's Kenan, he's malnourished. And so every day she has to go and find food and water for Kenan, walking long distances and carrying heavy weights. And she's distressed, she's distraught because she's having to make a nightmarish decision between protecting her unborn child or saving her son's life. And no parent should be faced with such a choice. But this is unfortunately not an unusual story in Gaza at the moment.
Michael, I'll come to you in just a moment, but I just want to go back to Dr. Tarek, picking up on what Tess was saying there, Doctor. How does malnutrition take hold in the body? What does starvation particularly do to young bodies in terms of their mental and physical development? And what does it mean for the elderly, for nursing mothers?
you've picked out the two most vulnerable categories of patients, with the third category being people with chronic illnesses. The very first stop is that the body is able to compensate. And that started a long time ago, basically at the beginning of the war as a best case scenario. The Israelis have been engineering starvation in Gaza since at least the early 2000s, when Dov Weisglass, Ehud Olmert's advisor, had talked about the Gaza diet and calorie restricting Palestinians. So at that point, when you're calorie restricted, you start using any fat reserves or stores so that your body can burn what it has and preserve the core functions, the essential functions. The next step is breaking down things like muscle. So one of the reasons why the late stages show people with almost no muscle is because the body will break it down. Muscle is highly nutritious in terms of the body, and so it will break down the muscle. At the point that we're at now, I'm going to skip a few steps. People, especially children and vulnerable people, are more or less in an irreversible condition. The kids who we are seeing who are malnourished, with the best treatment in the world, may survive in small numbers, maybe half of them or 2/3 of them. However, given that that's not what's going to happen, everybody who has malnutrition in Gaza today will die. Every single one of them. And that's because they are now reaching the stages where their end organs are starting to malfunction, where their kidneys are no longer working appropriately, where their livers are no longer working appropriately. These little children, they will have, at the best case scenario, irreversible damage. They will be cognitively stunted. They will be growth stunted. They will never meet the cognitive and the physical potential that they had. So these are the impacts of what's happening on a physical level. Of course, psychologically, there is a tremendous amount of devastation as well in terms of the food insecurity, watching the abject indifference of the world and all of this as well.
Michael, what do you make of what you just heard? The strategy of weaponizing food as deliberate and collective punishment by Israel, it isn't new. How on earth can this continue to be allowed to happen?
Adrian, I've been asking that question for the last 2 years. Israel announced its starvation campaign on October 9th, 2023, but this was after 25 years of a blockade and a hunger campaign against Gaza by the Israelis. And yet again, on March 1st, Prime Minister Netanyahu announced another round of a full blockade. So from March 2nd to around May 19th, nothing entered Gaza. No food, no medicine, no water, no humanitarian aid. That was 78 days. This is all after the International Court of Justice in March of 2025 recognized there was famine and starvation in Gaza. This is after the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Minister of Defense Gallant in November 2024 for the war crime of starvation. And this is after we, as the UN independent human rights experts, declared a famine in Gaza in July 2024. And yet the world still does nothing. And Israel continues to starve the Palestinians unabated, announcing its intent and executing its plan, causing this misery and horror. So how should the international community respond now, Michael? It could be argued, I suppose, that every famine is man-made, political, but this is not. This is not a natural disaster. This is deliberate. It's a man-made famine. What should the international community be doing now? And will the release of this report have any impact upon the legal cases that you talked about? The release of the IPC report finding famine in Gaza is the final word. As I outlined, all these instances, all these mechanisms have been raising the alarm, pointing to the fact that Israel has been starving the Palestinians. The IPC report these reports tend to be conservative, meaning the situation is always worse than an IPC report is able to measure. And now with the IPC report, we can finally stop debating the question, is there a famine? It is unequivocal at this point. And so the question is, what is to be done? a political problem needs a political solution. Usually, we would turn to the Security Council to do something at this stage. However, the United States keeps vetoing any Security Council resolution for a ceasefire, and a ceasefire is necessary to ensure that this genocide and starvation campaign ends. So in a case where there's a deadlock because of a veto, the General Assembly in New York has the authority to call for peacekeepers to accompany humanitarian convoys to enter. And with peacekeepers accompanying those convoys, then the UN, the International Red Cross, and other humanitarian organizations can get in there and do their job.
Tess, is any aid getting through at all? Dr. Tarek was saying that he did manage to eat today one meal. Tell us something about what people are managing to eat and drink and where they're getting that from.
Most of the families that I've spoken to have talked about getting one meal a day per family, not per person, from a community kitchen, and generally that being a small bowl of rice or lentils. The parents are often skipping eating any of that, sometimes up to 3 days at a time, in order to make sure that their children are eating. So, of course, food is incredibly scarce. What little is floating around the markets is very expensive. And so people just cannot afford it. And people have exhausted all of their coping mechanisms to try and find something to eat. In terms of what is getting in from the United Nations, we should be getting 500 to 600 trucks a day of aid into the Gaza Strip. That's what we believe is needed to meet people's basic needs. And that's what we were able to do during the ceasefire. So we've proved that it's logistically possible. But unfortunately, at the moment, we're getting 100 trucks in on a good day. And that's just into Gaza. We then have to be able to collect those trucks from the crossing and take them to the people that need them. And that doesn't always happen. We face tremendous bureaucratic, logistical impediments that stop us from getting that aid to the vulnerable families.
Dr. Tarek, you told us at the beginning that most of the patients that you're seeing aren't coming to you because of malnutrition and starvation. They're coming in because they've been injured by Israel's military action. How do victims of indiscriminate bombings recover from their injuries in these conditions? As we know, unsanitary conditions raise the risk of infection. We've talked about that on previous editions of Inside Story. Infection-fighting drugs are in extremely short supply. Can a patient who is starving fight infection?
The answer is no. Patients are not able to recover in any way that we would consider to be meaningful. The rates of infection, look, I've worked in war zones all across the world. The rates of infection during war are always higher than they are in a place that's not at war. That's pretty straightforward. However, what we're seeing here isn't just that. This isn't just a problem of poor infection control or some low resources. Patients do not have the protein they need to recover. So when the Israelis did cut off food, all that they allowed, even until today, there's no highly nutritious food or even mildly nutritious food coming in. I hadn't even been in Gaza for a couple of weeks. So that was about 4 months into the March siege when I saw my first case of scurvy. The patient was describing to me all of the classic symptoms. I mean, this is a disease that should be relegated to the history books and novels from the 1800s, not to Palestine today, a place that is able to make its own food, if not for the fact that 98% of all of their agricultural lands are razed, destroyed, and inaccessible. So the patients are not healing. They come to me with awful infections, with pus oozing out everywhere, and with surgical sites that should be able to connect that can't, because there's nothing to build those connections with. I think the other point here, when we talk about the fact that this is engineered, this is the policy. The Israelis want to kill all of the Palestinians. That's clear from the rhetoric, that's clear from the policy, and that's clear from what we see on the ground. And that's why we see so many people who are shot and wounded. As Tess mentioned, this is not a logistical problem. This is a political problem. And that's why we have to support every form of resistance against the Israelis.
Michael, what do you make of that? I want to pick up on something that you were saying in your earlier answer. You and other UN experts recognized famine conditions in Gaza a year ago. Why has it taken the IPC this long to reach the same conclusions? What assessments have they made, and how do they differ from conclusions that were drawn earlier? Has the IPC made this analysis to allow for states and other international organizations to also declare famine in Gaza? And what difference will that make?
Right. The IPC doesn't formally declare famine. It measures, it reports and measures, and they use an analysis that is measuring. It has three criteria. First, at least 20% of the population is experiencing food shortage. Second, where 1/3 of children are acutely malnourished. And the third criteria is that 2 people are dying per day for every 10,000 inhabitants due to outright starvation or malnutrition and disease. And it's geared towards triggering humanitarian action in donors. But in the human rights community, we don't wait as long. We don't have to focus on measuring pain, suffering, and death. We raised the alarm when we started seeing the first children dying from malnutrition and starvation. Because as we heard from Tess from UNICEF, when a parent is holding their child in their arms and that child is wasting away and dying, that means that an entire community is under attack. Because the first thing any community does when they're hungry is they feed their children. They feed their neighbors' children. They feed their community's children. And if you're unable to feed your child, that means you are being starved. So we raised the alarm a year ago from a human rights perspective, bringing in more context. The IPC tends to be on the conservative side, meaning the situation is always worse than an IPC report. They go in empirically, and when an IPC report finds a case of famine, that's it. There's no more question. There's no more doubt. There's no more debate. And it becomes a time for real political action.
Okay. And why is international law so impotent as a professor of law?
International law is only as strong as governments' ability to work together and to cooperate and to take action. So governments have just done nothing. They've not imposed real sanctions against Israel. They have not worked collectively within the United Nations strongly enough. But what we have seen are ordinary people in the world enforcing international law. We see this with the Gaza Freedom Flotilla, with ordinary people from around the world getting on boats and trying to break through Israel's illegal naval blockade and Israel's illegal occupation. So people are taking international law into their own hands. And I think governments from around the world are failing and are becoming illegitimate in the eyes of people around the world. Millions of people are marching around the world because they recognize their own oppression and the failure of their own governments in not standing up against Israel and preventing genocide and starvation.
Tess, as we said at the beginning of the programme, far from being shamed, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu plans to widen his war further. Gaza City, of course, coming under continued attack. People fleeing there at the moment, moving further south towards you. What are they telling you about conditions there, the availability of food and water, and what they've suffered in the previous weeks and months?
Well, as we've known for a long time now, and as this IPC report has confirmed, the conditions in Gaza City are among the worst in the Gaza Strip, except perhaps for North Gaza, where we have even a less of an idea of what is happening there because we have such limited access. But what we're hearing from people in Gaza City is that they are starving. Again, they are barely managing one meal a day. They don't have the dietary diversity that Tarek was mentioning that children need to grow and develop properly. No nutrients from fruit or vegetables or meat or eggs, that is not available. And so we're seeing really high levels of malnutrition among children in Gaza City, almost 20% at the moment from our screenings, which is above famine thresholds. And it's of grave concern, particularly now with this talk of an increased military offensive in Gaza City. We have to connect these two things as an international community. An escalation in an area where a famine has just been classified. Surely everything must be done that's in our power to prevent that from happening. As UNICEF, we're incredibly concerned about what that means for the thousands of malnourished children that are there, but also for babies in incubators, for injured children in intensive care units, for children with disabilities, for families that have elderly members and young children and are worried about having to split the family. All of these factors come with the threat of mass displacement and the escalation of a military offensive. Of course, then, we're concerned about the people that might be trapped. What about the people who choose or are forced to leave Gaza City? They're being told to come here to me in Al-Mawasi, where it is not safe. A tent in Mawasi today was hit by a strike and children were reportedly killed. It's an incredibly crowded area where already people don't have access to enough food, water, medical services, the basics that people need to survive. And then we're talking about hundreds of thousands more people potentially coming here. I always think that the situation cannot get worse than it is right now, but somehow it continues to. So again, we urgently calling on the international community to do everything they can to press the Israeli authorities, one, to agree a ceasefire, both parties, two, to the Israeli authorities to allow aid into the Gaza Strip at scale and allow that aid to reach the people who need it with safety and with dignity, including in Gaza City and the north of Gaza, and to reconsider this Gaza City offensive, which, as I said, would just be a catastrophe.
Dr. Tarek, as we move towards the end of our discussion, what's your message from Gaza to the international community?
I think the most important thing to realize here is that Israel is an active belligerent whose goal is to exterminate Palestinians. The famine didn't happen by accident. There's nothing here really that's happening by accident. Everything is deliberate. And so the international community can't take an approach in which they try to cajole or convince Israel. They have to stop Israel. That's what we're calling for, every form of resistance. Right now, frankly, the only form of resistance that's altering Israel's calculations is the armed resistance on the ground. And we have to match their energy where we are everywhere in the world so that the Israelis know that they will be stopped if they continue along this path.
And Michael, we've got about a minute left on the program. From a legal perspective, what's your message to the international community?
We have all the legal tools we need. We have all the court decisions. We have all the laws there. It's clear that there are war crimes, that it is a crime against humanity, that it is genocide. The UN has failed. The UN has essentially collapsed on this issue, and governments are going to lose elections on this issue. This is changing the world, and the world knows, and the world governments know, they must act now or they're next.
There, we must end it. Many thanks indeed for being with us. Michael Fakhri, Dr. Tarek, Loubani, and Tess Ingram. And thanks for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, join us at our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can join the conversation on X, our handle at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian, Finighan, and the team here. Bye for now.
Don't miss out. Get the full picture. Subscribe to Al Jazeera for reliable news, expert insight. Like, share, stay ahead.